This is Cam Barber, and you're listening to What's Your Message? A podcast where we chat about two things. Firstly, how messaging is used in our society to bring attention to ideas, products, causes, politics, and to leadership in general. And secondly, we're going to ask people about their challenges and their breakthroughs as they develop their public speaking skills. Welcome to the What's Your Message podcast. I'm Cam Barber and I'm here with Craig Bruce.
Hello.
Hello. And you might be wondering where we're recording from. Well, we're recording from Stanford University. Beautiful place, halfway in between sort of San Francisco and San Jose, right in and around Silicon Valley. And look at the light here, mate. Isn't it incredible?
It's just tremendous, isn't it? There's something about Californian sun. It's unbelievable.
It's beautiful. Look, there's green grass here. So this is a wonderful, beautiful university. And we're here because even though we're talking about structuring ideas for presentations and speeches, what we call the chunk structure, we're going to lead into the most watched speech of all time, which is Steve Jobs' Stanford commencement speech, delivered at Stanford University in 2005.
How many views did it actually have?
Well, there's 3 or 4 YouTube recordings, so I estimate it's about 200 million.
Is that right?
So one's got
Wow.
60, one's got 80, and so on. So yeah, the most watched speech of all time.
Why was it so good?
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll get into chunks. Before we do, I've got to tell you a little bit about our location here at Stanford University. This is what I call an imaginary location.
Yes.
So we may or may not actually be in Stanford. But the reason I'm bringing this up, and I think I'm going to do this if Craig doesn't talk me out of it, at the start of each podcast, because the location is engaging and interesting and helps listeners, register what's happening in your mind. It's more engaging, it's easier to remember because we've got these physical triggers, these physical locations. And one of the reasons that I thought this would be a good idea is that Jerry Seinfeld was talking about TV, and he was being interviewed on a few things. He talked about watching Larry King.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he used to say...
With the dots behind him?
Yeah, well, he just said, 9 o'clock, I'd switch on Larry King. And whoever was interviewing said, "Oh, did you really love Larry King?" He goes, "Not really, but it was just the place. It was just the location, that same setting. He's sitting on the desk. He's got the suspenders on.
Yeah.
I liked it." He said, "That's my theory about great TV. It's the location."
Okay.
And the guy was interviewing laughed, and he said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well," he said, if you like the place, you're going to more likely enjoy the program."
Right.
And then I realised, Craig, what's Jerry Seinfeld doing now, apart from some great sold out shows?
Coffee in cars.
Comedians in cars drinking coffee. How specific is that? Yeah. And how visual is that?
Yep.
And so I've been watching these, and I didn't realise until he pointed this out that I'm dying to know what car he chose.
Yeah.
And they zoom in and they talk about it, and then so a few things happen every time. There's a different car, we get a profile of the car, we get told why that car matches
They're
this
all his
comedian.
cars as well, though, aren't they?
I don't think so.
Aren't they? He's a car collector. He has many, many cars.
Geez, that would be impressive.
Well, he certainly collects Porsches. He has as many as a man worth $800 million should have. But he's been collecting...
How many is that?
Well, he's been collecting Porsches for years.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, he's obviously a car guy.
Right.
Actually, as a diversion here, I do remember when he did Jim Carrey, and he rolled up in some great older car, it was and Jim Carrey's environmentally focused, looking for an electric car. Right. And he brings this up. Jerry didn't realise. He's like, "No, I just love cars," right? So Jim Carrey sort of says something about the fumes, and he goes, "Oh no, those electric cars, they haven't got the same feel to them, in your balls, it's not good." And Jim goes, "Okay, well, I guess we love what you're spewing out."
Yeah.
Anyway, what do we get every time we switch on comedians in cars getting coffee? We get a few locations. So we get the car, we get an explanation of why that car matches that comedian, then they pick them up. So there's always, you stop outside of their place. There's a phone call within the car. where Jerry says, "Hey, you ready?" And the person's on the other end of the phone says, "Yeah, come and pick me up," whatever. So that always happens. Consistency. Then you see the camera of them walking out of their house or close out of their house into the car, them getting into the car, and then they do what? Half the show driving around in the car, and then they stop at a coffee place, and then you get cameras zooming on that barista, that piece of coffee, that grinder, the zoom in on which is it an espresso or is it a flat white or whatever it is, and they sit in that cafe, which is a different location. So he convinced me that he knows what he's doing. He's got more Porsches than I do at the moment, and we should take his genius and say, yeah, let's do it. Look, when the budget improves, I tell you what, when we get Apple sponsoring the What's Your Message podcast,
we may end up there.
We'll end up wherever we need to be.
Yeah.
But at the moment, we're doing more of an imaginary location.
In our mind's eye, we are in Stanford, at Stanford.
And I hope you don't feel cheated by that, listeners.
So the chunk theory.
Right.
We're going to talk about it in the context of the Steve Jobs presentation at Stanford in 2005. So what is the chunk theory? Is that your idea or is that your concept?
I guess the chunk structure is my idea, and if you look at the book, my book's called What's Your Message. You don't even have to do that. The book's called What's Your Message. Sorry, let's not let that hang. You could go to speechoutline.com and have a look at the chunk structure. So there's an app, a web app that we've created, which is free, that allows you to pull post-it notes across this chunk structure. So it's basically 2, 3 or 4 columns or chunks. There's a start and an end to each chunk, and then you have some preamble or introduction to a speech, and then your message at the end, so top and bottom.
Right.
So
why do you need a chunk structure if you're presenting?
I'll come back and I'll still answer your question because I think it's important. So we developed the chunk structure, but it was built off the chunking principle, which has been studied for decades, still is studied in university. The original paper, I think most people credit, is Professor George Miller, The Magical Number 7 ± 2, Harvard Review 1956. So in this paper, 70 or so pages, Professor Miller talks about a number of things. Talks about the human mind, and the basic idea, the basic message is that the human mind becomes overwhelmed incredibly easily. And it's basically a filtering mechanism, and it will forget just about everything unless there is some sort of mechanism to help it remember. So that might be a visual trigger. But the most common one, and he talked about the chunking principle, is breaking things into chunks. And then when I was in marketing, back in radio days, so Craig, if you know the story, was on air, and then later as program director, and I was in sales. So I was a suit, and he used to wear flip-flops and shorts.
Nothing has changed.
So we studied marketing, and we learned basic concepts around the chunking principle helped us market better. So we know that people can only remember sort of 2 to 5 things easily in their mind. So if you're in a category, let's say running shoes, and we know that what's the top of that category for most people? Nike, probably. It's changed over the years, over marketing, but what do we had? Nike, Reebok, Adidas, Puma, that sort of stuff. So what we learnt is, if you, say, wanted to get into marketing running shoes, the budget required for you to try and get into the mind and displace a Reebok or an Adidas or a Nike would be massive. You just can't do it. So what you do is you start a new chunk or a new category. And this was done very successfully many times. So Converse said, well, we're competing in a new category, not running shoes, that's too broad, we're basketball. So now people can go, the human mind can say, oh, basketball, yeah, I can remember 2 or 3 or 4 things in the basketball category. So yeah, if I want basketball, I'll get the Converse or I'll get whatever. And Reebok, in fact, started off as the aerobics shoe. So it was only that they had such success there that they were able to move into the broad category of running shoes.
So Lululemon started in yoga.
Correct.
Moving now towards apparel
lifestyle
in
clothing.
Yep. Okay.
So the chunking principle has existed for many years, and it's about the amount of information the human mind can process or retain. And so as a speaker making a presentation, or anyone really wanting to persuade, you need to understand this. The human mind becomes overwhelmed incredibly easily. And if you're not using some sort of mechanism to simplify it or to structure it, you lose their attention.
Right.
So we use this very powerful but very simple chunk structure.
So, and it kind of mirrors the basics of storytelling, doesn't it? You know, beginning, middle, end.
Sure.
And you know, from an acting perspective, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3.
Yeah.
You know, the moral of the story is at the end of Act 3.
Yeah.
So you see it in lots of different forms of communication, don't you? It's
Oh
just
yeah,
a matter
we haven't
of-
invented that. You know,
Yeah.
the basic outline of an essay or a 3-act play or screenplay, something that's existed for many, many years. All we did was put it into this visual look with the columns and the yellow post-it notes for the start of a chunk, white for the detail, yellow post-it note for the end. So yes, if I can't show it to you on radio, on podcast, but yeah, there's a visual look to it that for many people, not for everybody, but for many people and tens of thousands of clients we've worked with, it just makes it easier to process as a visual set of chunks rather than just a chunked idea.
Yeah, and I've used it plenty of times, and that's exactly what it does. Does the length of the presentation, because a lot of the examples that you have had it has 1, 2, and 3, with a moral to the story at the end, essentially in acting parts. Does the length of the presentation determine how many chunks you need? I mean, let's say I'm doing an hour-long speech versus a 20-minute speech. Do I need? Am I extending past 3 chunks or 5 chunks, or what? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a question that comes up very quickly every time we start talking about chunking. The answer is no, and the simple reason for that is whether you're speaking for 5 minutes or an hour, the capacity of the human mind that you're in your audience doesn't change. So I'll give you an example of this. If you ask people to remember 3 things, there's a chance they'll do it. Who are the 3 Stooges?
Yep.
Larry, Moe and Curly. I mean, we don't hear much about the 3 Stooges anymore, but if you said, who are the 3, you could remember that. Whereas if someone said, there are 7 things, can you remember those 7 things from Craig's presentation last week? No way. There's virtually no way, unless some certain device or song or technique or whatever was used to hook that in your mind, because 7 is too many things. And I've tested this many times. I've said to audiences, and you have to pick one person, you can't do it as a group. You pick one person, and I even ask, who knows the names of the 7 dwarfs? So I'm only asking people that say they know. I'm not just picking a random person.
Right.
So virtually every time a person who says, I know the 7 dwarfs, I said, great, tell us who they are. At about 5 dwarfs, their eyes sort of roll up and to the left and to the right, and they go, now did I already say sneezy? No, I said, hang on, did I say? So it's just a simple little analogy or a little story that shows you that about 5 things is too much for us to process.
Yep.
And the phone number is an example. Most countries in the world, and this is changing unfortunately now because we don't even remember phone numbers, they're all in our smartphone. But a phone number, let's take the United States, is a 7-digit number broken into 2 parts that are different sizes. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's not an accident. That was designed that way so that people could remember phone numbers. They knew that if you didn't have any spaces or pauses in that, people couldn't remember them.
Right.
And then you might say, well, hang on, what about the area code for the state or the location I'm in? Well, guess what? That's in brackets. It's in parentheses, which shows that it's a separate chunk. So if you say, how many numbers can you remember? Well, 3 or 4 or 5. Hang on, what if I chunked them and use different formatting for different chunks? I can probably remember 15.
Yep.
UK, I want to call the UK. So I get out of my country, whatever that is, I can just press plus now. And then the UK, to get into the UK is 44. I can remember that, 44, UK, 44, no problem. And then there's an area code, well, that's 2 or 3 digits, 721. I can remember 721, and it's separate to the country because it's a separate chunk. And then all I have to do is remember the 6 or 7 digit phone number.
Right.
So now what's that? That's, let's say 7 plus 4 plus 2 is 13. So now I can remember 13 numbers really quite easily because I've used the chunking principle.
Right.
You don't really want to change the number of chunks. So what you're going to change if you go from a 5-minute presentation to a 1-hour presentation is the amount of detail within the chunk.
Yeah. So at the start of every chunk is a premise?
I wouldn't call it a premise. It's a label.
It's a label.
So the best way to think about it is that if you were saying, hey, I'm about to give a talk and I'm going to cover these 3 chunks.
Sure.
Right? So then you state what they're called. So it's not necessarily a premise. It's like, hey, we're going to talk about what happened last year. the challenges for this year, and the things to focus on going forward.
Yep.
So it's just, what is the best label for what's in the chunk? Here's what Steve Jobs did. He opened his presentation and said, today I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. No big deal, just 3 stories. So you see what he's done there. He's beautifully said, this is going to be easy.
Do you think that he thought about the presentation in chunks?
Absolutely.
Do you think so?
Well, you see it in so many of his presentations.
Right,
We'll
okay.
talk about more of them. And buy the book. It's called What's Your Message?
Yep.
By Cam Barber, Public Speaking with Twice the Impact Using Half the Effort. And there's about 4 Steve Jobs examples alone.
How do you make something sound natural and authentic and real, whilst you're also thinking about this chunk structure? And how do you turn that into a natural conversation? Because it didn't sound like I was being presented anything in chunks by Steve Jobs whenever I see that speech.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because you're right, and I forget this, having been exposed to it for so long, that if you say the word structure to people, it sounds robotic, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like it's going to give you the freedom to relax and be yourself. It sounds like it's going to force you into a box. But the truth is, it does the opposite of forcing you into a box. It gives you the freedom to be yourself, because instead of starting a speech that's a long, windy path through a jungle that doesn't end for 19 and a half minutes, you have these shorter paths, these shorter journeys that have an ending. So, what did I say before? So we're going to, hang on, let's go to Steve Jobs.
Yep.
So what were the names of his 3 chunks? He said, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. The first one is about connecting the dots. So you go, I don't quite know what that means, but it'll probably become clear. And so now, even though he had a 15-minute speech, this is a 3-minute or 4-minute chunk where he tells a story and he shows you how connecting the dots ties in. And the basic point there is that he says, you can't connect the dots about your decisions until later. So you should trust your decisions. All right? And he uses a great example of how he studied calligraphy at university, where he was certain there was no practical application whatsoever, but he was Steve F. Jobs, and he can do whatever he wants, and he thought it was beautiful. So he studied calligraphy and the way letters are formed, and spacing and kerning, and take 3 hours to write one little A4 letter page sign, because he thought it was beautiful. And then 10 years later, he was developing the Macintosh computer, the first computer that ever had flexible fonts.
Right.
Or even legible fonts, really. Prior to that, there was one ugly computer font that didn't really have any spacing or kerning. And he explained that this experience with calligraphy was invaluable. So he says, you can't connect the dots. So there's the point. So he set it up. This story's about connecting the dots. He tells a 4-minute story, and then he wraps it up at the end, right?
Sure.
Start a chunk, go through the detail of the chunk, wrap it up at the end.
Yeah.
And the wrap-up was, you can't tell if it's going to connect. So trust your judgment more.
Yep.
Thanks, Steve.
And what was his second
story? Now, I'm not looking at these at notes, by the way. I'm trusting that I'm going to remember them.
Yeah.
I guess I've talked about them a couple of times, but there's only 3, so it's not that hard. Second story is about love and loss. The story within that is that he started Apple when he was 20 and got sacked when he was 30. So basically, he went through this embarrassing, public, awkward kicking and screaming, sacking from the board.
Humiliation.
Humiliation of the company that he founded. And he said, he had a lot of money. He had his $100 million from the shares that he sold, which is great. And he said, look, I thought I could do art, I could go to Japan, I could study in Europe. But then he sat down and he said, I love tech. I reckon I've got another computer in me. Even though it's a bit embarrassing, I'm going to stay in Silicon Valley and I'm going to try again. And so this was a 10-year period where if you spoke to him and you looked at it for that 10 years, it looked like everything was going bad. So he started a company called Next, NEXT Computers. Many of you won't have heard of it because it didn't go that well. They made black computers. They stopped making computers after a few years because they weren't making enough money, and they said, well, our software's really good though. Our operating system is great. Let's see if we can just offer that and have that go on a Mac or a PC or so on because it's the best software. And they kept going for a few more years. I'll come back to the end of that story in a second. So that was one thing that was costing him money. So he had $100 million. Basically, every quarter, he put his hand in his pocket and paid to keep these businesses running. They were running at a loss.
Right.
The other business that he bought from Industrial Light and Magic was a rendering software. So this is rendering graphics, which was hard work and computer intensive back in, 1985 or something. And again, he thought this had potential, but it was making a loss every month, every quarter. So he was basically working through his fortune. Publicly, it looked like, well, Steve Jobs, he did do well at Apple, but nothing's really firing. And so that rendering software didn't sell. And then they said, well, we've got the technology. Why don't we start doing the rendering ourselves? Maybe we could make animation, computer animation that hasn't been done. I think we're the leaders in that. And of course, so what happened with these two businesses? One became Pixar, which he sold to Disney for $4.5 billion. And the other, the software from Next, was purchased by Apple, whose software hadn't grown since he left, hadn't been improved, and and they made enough money, made $500 million or something on it to pay the costs and make a bit of a profit, and that is what brought him back to Apple for its second huge renaissance. And he also adds that in that 10-year period of love and loss, he met his wife. He sort of talked about the fact that he was the kind of guy who might not have got married because he was so intense, and he had kids, and that was just a wonderful thing. So again, he finishes that with, if you don't love what you do, you probably won't do great work. And I made some decisions that were really difficult, but I stuck with what I loved, and it ended up working out.
Right.
And by the way, as I'm sort of delivering these messages and telling the story of this speech, remember who his audience is. It's university students.
Bunch of young
college people who are basically, what's the question they're asking in the mind? If you want to be a good persuader, get good at asking what is the question or what are the issues in the mind of your listener. And they're thinking, I haven't been to work yet. I've got a degree or I'm about to get a degree. Steve Jobs seems to have done pretty well. What's he got for me? What should I think about? How should I act? What's the wisdom you can give me as I go out into the world?
Yeah.
And all of these points and stories are tightly targeted to that perspective.
Do you have to have a brilliant story in the middle of the beginning and the end?
No.
Because that kind of, I'm wondering what the Steve Jobs speech would have been like if he didn't have those three chapters of his life and those amazing stories that he brought to that speech, because that illuminated the points, didn't it? You know, I'm going to make a point, but I'm going to tell it through a story.
Absolutely.
Which is a bit different to, I'm going to make a point and now I'm going to talk about the black and white
figures, the monthly figures here or whatever.
Here's a bunch of budgets and here's some HR decisions we need to make.
It helps to have a story.
Yeah.
It certainly doesn't hurt. You don't need it though, necessarily. So sometimes the story works, but see, he could have gotten quotes from somebody else. He could have referred to a movie scene. There's many things he could have done that didn't have to pull from his own experience. It might not have worked in this situation because that's what he's there for. They're there for his story,
his life,
right?
Yep.
But your question is for everybody else, do we always need to have a story in between the chunks? The answer is no. It's nice if you can do it. Storytelling is in fact, in my book, one of the 9 things that you can do to further engage your audience. So it's great, but it's not required. What's required is that however your chunk ends, that the content, I call it the detail, within the chunk has to prove that. So let's say your chunk ends with a claim. What did I do today? Who was I with today? The claim is that we negotiate better deals for you. We're a buying group and we negotiate better deals for you. Mm-hmm. That's how it ends. That's the point of the first chunk. So you've just got to go back and go, okay, how do we prove that that's true? Because the skeptical mind says, I'm pretty good at negotiating. You know, I like running my own show. Why do I want to lose some autonomy and join a buying group? So all it needs is enough evidence or examples or case studies or proof that that claim is true.
Public speaking has evolved, and most people haven't caught up. Fortunately, there is a book to guide you. The book is called What's Your Message by Barber. It's available in paperback, ebook and audio formats, and it dispels the myths of the traditional approach to public speaking and gives you a simple 3-part method for success. What's Your Message helps you dissolve public speaking anxiety and promises to give you twice the impact with half the effort. What's Your Message by Cam Barber. Available at Amazon and all good bookstores.
You talked about liking the way something sounds, so through the rehearsal process, and we'll get to chunk 3 of Steve Jobs' presentation in a minute.
We'll do that next week. Thanks for listening. Sign up for the next one if you want to hear how that speech ends.
Liking the way something sounds. So through the rehearsal process, you're encouraging people to speak out aloud and to hear the words and how they come together. Why is that important?
It's important because of the closeness problem. Now, the closeness problem, you can probably guess what I'm talking about, and I've spoken about this and written a couple of articles, and it's because it's in the book as well. The closeness problem is that the closer we are as human beings, the closer we are to a subject, the more experience we have, the more we care about it, the more exposure we have to it, the harder it becomes to see the perspective of somebody else. And I use the example of giving directions. So I've just done this so many times, it works with every audience in every country. I say, has anyone ever used these words when giving directions? Blah, 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 blah. You can't miss it. And virtually everybody laughs and smiles and goes, yeah, those idiots. They all do it. Well, you know what? If everybody else does it, that means you and I do it too.
Yep.
And that is the closeness problem. So the closeness problem in this case with giving directions is if I say the words, yeah, and when you get to that point, it's just around the corner. Well, I've got the closest problem because I know what that corner looks like. In fact, I've got a picture in my head of that exact corner and the shop that's on the left and so on. So your experience, though, might be, I see 4 corners here. There's usually 3 other corners pretty close, right?
Yep.
And you haven't really made it clear which one I should be focusing on. Oh, and by the way, when you say just around, as Cam uses the rabbit ears in the air, when you say just around the corner, is that 5 steps or 500 steps? So the closeness problem is very important to understand because a lot of us think we're clear, but we're not. Now, when you recognise the closeness problem exists, you just automatically get better at being objective and clarifying ideas for your audience better. But the speaking it out loud is very helpful in breaking through that closeness problem. A lot of people will write down their notes for a speech. They'll use an outline. For example, one of the common outlines for preparing a speech says, write a purpose statement or write your objectives statement for this speech. Well, that's not a bad starting point, but when is that converted to the actual words you're going to say?
Right.
In many cases, never. So you know in your mind, I want to get them to sign up for this program, but you actually haven't worked out the words you're going to use to show them that this is the greatest program and these are the benefits and they should sign up. So a lot of people will write out their outline, look at it, read it again, and never say it out loud. So the
Really?
first, absolutely, Craig.
Find that hard to believe.
Well, it happens a lot. So then the first time you're really stating these important points is when you're in front of the audience under the pressure of the spotlight,
Wow.
not thinking clearly.
Okay.
So let's call it a sliding scale. Let's say some people never test it out loud and some people test it out loud a lot. Well, the more you do it, the more effortless it will be, the more certainty you'll have. But I think your question is more of a testing situation. I'm suggesting you should say this out loud to test whether it actually conveys what you want it to convey. And you get to you hear it a little bit more objectively, you have a gut reaction and an intellectual reaction. And so, yes, testing it, just this outline, not the whole speech.
Yeah.
Testing the outline out loud is incredibly valuable.
Because you've talked about the 1-minute rehearsal, which I guess ties into that as well. What does that? It sounds like what it is, which is you can work your way through a 20-minute presentation in a minute. How does it work in practice?
You've got to speak really quickly. No, you don't do that. The 1-minute rehearsal is amazing. I mean, it's just the best thing ever. How good is it? I mean, you and I have worked on this and you've done it before, so you know what. So the 1-minute rehearsal says that wonderfully, a full rehearsal where you practice every word of, say, a 20-minute speech is not as effective as doing a slow, calm 1-minute version where you blah, 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 or you ignore the detail. So the 1-minute rehearsal says, how are you going to start? Let's get the words right exactly. on how you're going to start. And we've got the chunk structure to help us. So you go, hey, little preamble. Today we're here to talk about X, Y, Z. We're going to focus on 3 stories. What is it? Connecting the dots. Second story is about love and loss. The third story is about death. So that's the rhythm of a good start. It's also a major part of your chunk structure, and it takes 20 seconds to test. So do that, test it, see if it flows, modify it, change it. I mean, you can just make it 3 times sharper and clearer and more comfortable in your own language. I don't know if we finished that whole, it makes you feel robotic. This is the reason why a structure helps you be more relaxed and more natural than not having one. Because you go, well, I'm going to do the opening. The opening's got the title. G'day, we're here to talk about X, Y, Z. It's done. I can relax. That bit's done.
Yep.
The next bit, introducing those chunks. What are they? Oh, well, there's 3 chunks. We're going to talk about a story with connecting the dots. Then there's another one with love and loss. Another one about death. Hey, you know what? I just finished the overview. Oh, this is great. All right, well, why don't I get into that first chunk? And then you just go through it. So it doesn't force you to be robotic. It gives you a chance to rest, to gather your thoughts, and from the audience's perspective, not to train wreck all these ideas into one long 20-minute sentence.
Yep. And the chunk theory can also work from a day-to-day meeting perspective. If you're, this is how I would use it in my previous work, where I'd have a lot of meetings. I would take that chunk theory, and then if I've got a session with a breakfast show, having worked in radio, and there's some key messages that I wanted to get away, and I really needed to think my way through it, I would use that chunk theory for a one-on-one meeting, or a 1-in-5 meeting, or a small group session.
Look, forget calling it chunk theory. I mean, that helps me visually work it. But basically, we're saying what's going to be covered.
Yeah.
And please, sir, don't make it 28 things.
Yeah.
Right? Are there 2 to 4 things that we should cover that are priorities? And maybe there's a list of details that need to be covered. Well, let's put them into one heading.
Yep.
The extra details, and that's going to help me prepare. It's going to keep people engaged. I mean, how unproductive are meetings? Most meetings, if you're sitting in the meeting, you're not sure how long it goes for, you're not sure why you're there. Yes, it's incredibly valuable in doing that. I've got my 12-year-old son, I think since about the age of 8, so I tell him these things, and every now and then, I don't lecture him, or I don't think I do, but he's got into the habit of speaking like this to me, and it's hilarious that he'll go, Dad, I think we should go to the snow. And I'm like, oh, mate, I'd love to too. I don't know if we've got some time. Dad, there's 2 reasons why we should go. And it stops me in my tracks. I'm like, well, the kid knows what he's talking about. I better listen to these 2 reasons.
Yep.
So it's very powerful.
Right. Do you need to have an idea behind the presentation, or if you're doing 15, 20 minutes, what comes first? I'm assuming the idea, the central idea, the central message needs to be the starting point, and then the chunks after that. How does that normally play out?
There's the perfect world, and if you follow our process, the Vivid method, we'll suggest that's right. You start by working out what your message is. It's like a destination. It's sort of like saying, hey, I'm going to get in the car and I'm going to go driving. Oh, where are you going? Well, I'm not sure.
Yep.
Well, I've got a car and I've got gas in the car. It's full of petrol, so I'm going to go. And I could go to New York, or I could turn left and go to Pittsburgh, or maybe go down to Washington DC. So that's a little bit how people prepare presentations. The message is your destination.
Right.
Where are you headed?
Yep.
So it's going to be a lot easier if you go, well, we're going to New York.
Yep.
Okay, well that cuts out a lot of detail, doesn't it? We don't have to look at the map over there in Pittsburgh. We just focus on what gets us to New York and what are the signposts and so on. So yes, optimally you go, what's my message? What is this idea I want to put into their head? This message that after they leave stays, they can recall and repeat. Once you've got that, working out the chunk structure from that point is easier. But I will say, you do whatever works.
So stay hungry.
You might have a presentation that's already ready, that's already done. I've got a client I'm working with in Houston in 3 days. They have 70 slides done, and they're full. They're chockers. There's an Australian term here. You ready? Chockers.
Chock-a-block.
Chock-a-block with detail, all 70 slides. And so they're like, well, have you got any tips for us? Well, Yeah, the first thing is this needs a structure. So we're going to apply retrospectively this chunk structure over the top,
Right.
As best we can, and work from there. So it's not a rigid format. There's a best practice, and there's how much time have we got, and what are we dealing with, and what's the best way to get it structured?
I mean, it's hard to answer this question because you won't know for sure, but do you think Steve Jobs started with the central idea of staying hungry, stay foolish?
Okay, so we're jumping to the end here. So let's...
Can you see what I've done? I'm now wrapping up your podcast. I'm a good student. So, do you think that he had that as the... Because I've seen lots of people have seen the presentation, and I remember moments, until today when I had a quick look at it again, the stay hungry, stay foolish part, I didn't really, didn't stick with me. Connecting the dots did.
Yeah.
And everyone has a different reaction to presentations. But I'm just wondering whether he started with that idea and then worked back from there in terms of the way he presented it.
I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think, being a message expert?
I can make a guess. I mean, there's an interesting story within the biography that big fat white biography that was published a few years ago, where they talked about that speech. And there's a good story to it. I'll tell you the story. So I'll make my guess, but I'll tell you why I'm making that guess.
Yep.
So Steve didn't make many of these speeches, and he accepted it partly because he'd had a health scare, and he'd come out of it, and he was okay, and he thought, maybe I should do some giving back. So he agreed to make the speech. I think he had 3 or 4 months before he had to do it. And so he owned Pixar, and he had contacts in the film industry, obviously, and he found a scriptwriter, and he said, hey, can you help me? I want to write a speech. If I'm Steve Jobs, it's going to be a great speech, so can you help me? And I'm busy being CEO of these other 2 companies and so on. So this scriptwriter said, sure, and they spoke over the phone and gave him a brief, and he said, okay, well, I'll come back to you in 2 or 3 weeks with a draft, and we can work through it. And Steve Jobs said, great, thank you. A month goes by. Don't hear back from him. Steve's like, oh yeah, where is that guy? I'll give him a call. Gives him a follow-up call. No response. Another month goes by. And he's like, holy cow, this guy's not getting back to me. I've got a month to go. And I think it was at about 2 weeks before where he sat down at his kitchen table, because he lived in he had a kitchen, he lived in a suburban house. And he said to his wife, I think I'm going to have to write this myself. And he sat down with his wife and they wrote it together on the kitchen table.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, and that Steve has used structure before, so I assume he's just fallen back to what he knows. Basic structure, how many key things are there, and what's the message? Now,
and who's my audience?
Of course, who's my audience. So, absolutely. So, did he craft the message first and then the stories? I don't know. It's hard to guess. I think what happens here is that the reason
I'm sticking to that point is because I think in everyday life, the starting point for most people when they're thinking about a presentation is, sometimes you're given a brief, which is we need to talk about X, or we're talking about your department. But normally, and maybe it's just something that I've found, but I tend to want to be able to start with where's the angle? What's the central idea here?
Yeah.
And then work back from there. And I don't know. I mean, it doesn't matter in the end because the presentation was so amazing. But I'm just wondering whether he had that as the end point, or whether that came to him.
Don't know, we're speculating, but let's make it interesting and call back to something we just talked about, which is testing it out loud. So there's a possibility that he's got his draft and they test it out loud, and there's maybe 5 messages that are beautiful, and that's too long, and that one fits at the bottom of the connecting the dots one, and so it may have changed.
Yeah, sure.
I think that you can see by the fact that all 3 stories, the key points for all 3 stories, and the stay hungry, stay foolish, all follow the same basic idea. So he would have been very clear on this, this key focus, which is, I get this audience, you're looking for some wisdom, I've just gone through university, I'm going out into the world, what should I care about, what should I focus on? And his basic message is, trust your own judgment.
Yeah, and the simplicity of it, which essentially everything Jobs made was simple and beautiful, and you look at it and there was nothing cluttered, there wasn't a single word out of place, everything worked, didn't it?
It did. As we say, what are the messages? Find what you love, Don't follow other people's thinking. He called that dogma. Stay hungry, stay foolish. That implies, this is the second chunk, love and loss. You can make mistakes.
Yep.
Right? You can make mistakes, but if you focus back on what you love, it might end up working out, and failure is not failure. It's just a guidance, and so on. So yeah, that's why I don't want to put too many thoughts, make too many projections. I did actually write a letter to Steve Jobs many years ago. I had some ideas for his marketing. The terrible bloke.
Did you really?
Yeah, he didn't respond, but his marketing manager did.
Okay.
Guy Kawasaki said, "Thanks, Cam."
Really, Guy Kawasaki?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what a great
What
guy.
did he say to you?
Let's see, what was the letter? I was saying that
He's unbelievable.
he's a super guru.
Amazing.
No, he's written 3 or 4 books. He's fantastic. He just said, I think it's got to be more about how easy it is to use. I'm not hearing that. I know you guys think the Mac is easy to use, but the fact that it's easy to use means you actually get more done. And I'm not hearing that. And what I'm hearing in the marketing is, think different and so on. And he basically very politely said, "I think we got this, Cam." Thank you for your comments. We were okay.
Right. Do you think he typed that back to you or not?
I feel like he did. Just the letter that I got. It's a short letter.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
who knows? But anyway, he
That's
responded.
so funny.
And
I
he
didn't know
read
that.
It, so.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so the third chapter in the Stanford story was about death.
Yeah. So the story at the time was he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which he was basically said this is a 95% mortality. And so he tells a story where for 24 hours he thought that he was going to die within weeks. Went and got a biopsy the next day, and they said this is in the 5% where we think we can operate, which they did, and it looked like he came out of it unscathed. Yes, he did die, 8 or 9 years later, but possibly from complications of other things. So at the point that he made this speech, he was basically saying, this brush with death was really useful because it made me realise we're all going to die. Sometime you're going to die, so you might as well live your own life with your own mistakes than following someone else's thinking.
Yeah, what did he say about waking up in the morning and knowing that it could be the last day of your life, and at some point that day is going to come?
Yeah, no. Well, I think I wish I had the quote. I thought it was something like,
"If you live each day."
Do I love what I'm doing today?
Yeah.
I look in the mirror. Do I love what I'm doing today? And if the answer is no, for I don't know how long it was,
for a few days in a row,
for a period, then change it.
Yep.
Good line. So then he did a preamble. When you look at this, you can Google this. Actually, I've written an article on this. So if you Google Steve Jobs Stanford Speech, or maybe Steve Jobs Stanford Structure, you'll find the article which sort of breaks this down and shows you the visual chunk structure, and then shows you the full script or the full text of his speech. And so what I've done is that I've got a fourth chunk which I'm calling a wrap up. So his message basically had a preamble. So he finished his 3 chunks, and then he said, let me tell you a story about this thing that happened when I was a kid. But it was basically that story led to stay hungry, stay foolish, which he then repeated. So he said, so my message to you is actually that message that I got from the back of that catalogue that I used to love. So as you go out, and so the final message in exact words is, as you go out to begin your lives anew, I wish you the same. Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of repetition that he used there, which worked well.
Yeah, which does work. It does work generally in terms of, if you've landed on something, it can help.
But just like anyone, you might go, do you know that second part of the third chunk, that's what resonated with me. Oh my God, at this age, whatever age I am now, that's the one that spoke to me. So I remember that, and not necessarily the final message or the earlier chunks. That's of course going to happen. Same as what we said before, everybody watches a different movie.
Yeah.
Even I watch a different movie when I'm 15 years old versus 35 years old versus a parent at 45 years old. So yes, we still might remember different highlights.
So what do you want this audience to remember from this podcast today?
Yeah, so we were talking before we started this, should I have a catch cry? There's got to be a catch cry, doesn't there? And it has to be, what's your message? So let me see if I can deliver this with any gravitas. So, thanks for listening to the podcast. This is Craig Bruce. I'm Cam Barber. And if you want to persuade, hang on, if you want to persuade, the question you need to answer is, what's your message? If you enjoyed the What's Your Message podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating on iTunes. Ratings are the best way to help share these ideas, and we would be most grateful for your help. My book is called What's Your Message, and it really is fantastic. It shows you how to speak with twice the impact using half the effort. It's available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook formats on Amazon and at all good bookstores. For information on training options and coaching products, please go to vividmethod.com. That's vividmethod.com. This is Cam Barber, and remember, persuasion is built on message recall. So, what's your message?